Welcome, where wars become stories. If you were asked what the deadliest war in American history was, your first thought might be to say the Second World War. After all, images of Normandy, Iwo Jima, and the mushroom cloud fill our cultural memory. Others might guess Vietnam with its nightly news broadcasts of body bags and burning jungles. But both answers would be wrong. The true costliest war in American history by far was the Civil War, a conflict fought not on foreign shores, but across America's own fields, towns, and rivers. More than 620,000 soldiers died between 1861 and 1865, a number that until the mid-20th century exceeded the combined deaths of every other American war. To put it in perspective, in a nation of only 31 million people, 8% of all American men were dead by the end of the conflict. Every village, every family, every church had empty seats. The war reached into homes with a cruel closeness that no overseas conflict ever could. And yet, strangely, this fact often slips from our memory. In popular imagination, World War II reigned supreme as the good war, while the Civil War is remembered more for its politics than its price in lives. But for those who lived through it, the Civil War was nothing less than a disaster. It shattered dreams of quick victory, turned fertile countryside to wasteland, and introduced the United States to a level of industrial killing that shocked even the soldiers themselves. What makes this all the more striking is that the Civil War happened before the invention of the machine gun as we know it, before tanks, airplanes, or high explosives. At first glance, the battles appear old-fashioned, men in lines, flags fluttering, cavalry charges. And yet, beneath that appearance of the past lurks something new, advancing weapon technology colliding with outdated fighting methods. This collision produced staggering losses that neither North nor South could fully understand until it was too late. But the story of Civil War death is not only about bullets and cannon fire. In fact, most men did not die from combat at all. Disease proved a far more ruthless killer than the battlefield. Measles, dysentery, and smallpox swept through military groups, killing soldiers before they ever saw a fight. Camps became breeding grounds for sickness where the simple act of drinking from the wrong stream could seal a man's fate. This combination, disease, improved weapons, and outdated strategy, created the perfect storm. To understand why the Civil War became America's deadliest war, we must look closer at the lived experience of the men who fought it, the young farm boys suddenly crammed into dirty barracks, the new rifles and bullets that shattered bone like glass, the booming artillery that tore through entire companies, and the commanders who held on to old-fashioned traditions even as the battlefield changed beneath their feet. The cost was not measured only in numbers, though the numbers are staggering. It was measured in the silence of rural communities missing half their sons, in mothers holding black-edged letters, in veterans limping home on crutches or never coming home at all. The Civil War's legacy is not simply that it preserved the Union or ended slavery. It is also that it introduced Americans to the modern age of warfare, where human lives could be consumed on an industrial scale. This is the story of why the American Civil War became the bloodiest chapter in the nation's history. And it begins not with the clash of guns, but with the invisible armies of disease that marched alongside every military group. When we think of war, we imagine bullets and sharp blades, cannon smoke, and cavalry charges. But in the American Civil War, the greatest killer was not gunfire or artillery. It was disease. Roughly 2/3 of all Civil War deaths were caused not by combat, but by sickness. That means for every soldier killed in battle, 2 more wasted away in a hospital tent or along the muddy ground of a camp, fevered and confused. The causes were grimly simple. Hundreds of thousands of young men, many from rural communities who had never traveled beyond their county line, suddenly found themselves crowded together in sprawling camps. They carried germs unfamiliar to others. What had been a mild childhood illness for one man might sweep through an entire military group of strangers with deadly effect. Measles, smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia became as feared as enemy fire. Dysentery alone, with its unrelenting grip on the intestines, killed more men than all the bullets at Gettysburg combined. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Soldiers often relieved themselves in shallow trenches dug too close to camp or upstream from their own drinking water. Rotting animal bodies, poorly buried waste, and stagnant pools became breeding grounds for disease. Many medical officers, trained in an era before germ theory, did not yet understand how diseases spread. They prescribed mercury-based pills, bloodletting, or doses of alcohol rather than fresh water, rest, and cleanliness. The very treatments often made a man's condition worse. The conditions inside makeshift hospitals were little better. Long rows of beds crammed into drafty barns or canvas tents where moans echoed through the night. Amputations were carried out on wooden tables, the blood pooling on the floor, the surgeon moving from one patient to the next with barely a rinse of his saw. Infection spread almost inevitably. Soldiers dreaded the word hospital as much as they dreaded charge. Yet amid this misery, there were flashes of resilience. Soldiers made up cures, pine needle tea for scurvy, makeshift bandages torn from shirts. Women volunteers from the North's United States Sanitary Commission to countless Confederate towns brought food, clean linens, and comfort to the sick. These early efforts hinted at the birth of modern battlefield nursing and public health reforms that would emerge after the war. Disease did more than claim lives. It reshaped strategy. At Chancellorsville, for example, nearly 5,000 Confederate soldiers were too ill to fight due to contaminated water supplies. Entire groups melted away, not under rifle fire, but under the weight of fever. Commanders were forced to adjust battle plans based not just on enemy strength, but on whether their own men were still standing. For soldiers, the terror of disease was constant and close. You could dodge a bullet, but you could not outrun the invisible. Letters home are filled with pleas for health, prayers against fever, and descriptions of comrades withering beside them. To many, the Civil War seemed less like a contest of armies and more like a lottery of survival, where a sip from the wrong well or a cough in the night might seal your fate. Before the first shots were even fired, disease ensured the Civil War would be the most lethal conflict America had ever known. And as the fighting got worse, the battlefield itself introduced new horrors, none more infamous than the bullet that defined the war, the mini-ball. If disease was the silent killer of the Civil War, the mini-ball was its brutal executioner. Named after the French army officer Claude Mini, this cone-shaped bullet seemed like a small innovation at first glance. Yet, it changed the nature of warfare forever. Before its invention, guns fired round balls that were slow to reload and terribly inaccurate. A soldier's survival often depended less on his aim than on luck and closeness. But with the mini-ball, everything changed. The bullet's hollow base allowed it to expand when fired, gripping the spiral grooves inside the gun barrel. This gave the bullet a deadly spin, dramatically improving accuracy and range. Suddenly, soldiers who once could barely hit a man at 50 yards could now reliably strike targets over 200 yards away. And thanks to its shape, the mini-ball was faster to load, meaning a group could pour shot after shot into an advancing enemy with terrifying efficiency. But the true horror of the mini-ball lay not in its precision, but in the wounds it caused. Unlike the round balls of earlier wars, which often passed cleanly through flesh, the mini-ball's heavy, slow-moving impact shattered bones like glass and tore jagged paths through muscle. Limbs struck were rarely savable. Field surgeons, lacking both the tools and the knowledge to mend shattered bones, often resorted to amputation as the only option. The sight of men missing arms and legs became a grimly common feature of post-war America. One Confederate soldier described the effect bluntly: a man hit by a mini-ball might as well be struck by a cannon. Another Union doctor recorded that the bullet left wounds so destructive of the tissues that nothing can be done but the knife for the wounded. The agony did not end on the battlefield. Infection set in quickly. The stench of gangrene clung to hospitals, and men prayed for ether or chloroform before the saw touched their flesh. Yet even as the mini-ball multiplied casualties, it also made the battlefield equal. No longer was killing confined to elite marksmen or hidden artillery. Every soldier, even a farm boy barely trained in gun drill, now wielded a weapon capable of deadly precision. This reality forced armies to confront a paradox: while the tools of war had advanced, the tactics remained stuck in the past. Officers still ordered their men into straight-line formations, shoulder to shoulder, as if they were fighting in the days of Napoleon. Against the mini-ball, such formations became little more than rows of targets. The bullet thus became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a world caught between two eras, a weapon designed in the age of science and industry, unleashed within a military system still bound by 18th-century tradition. That clash would turn ordinary battlefields into slaughterhouses. And as deadly as the mini-ball was, it was not the only terror soldiers faced. Looming behind the lines, shaking the very earth with its thunder, came the cannons. The mini-ball alone did not make the Civil War so deadly. It was its marriage to the rifled gun that transformed killing into something industrial. Before the 1850s, smoothbore guns were the infantryman's standard weapon. They were quick to load, but wildly inaccurate beyond 50 yards. A blast fired at 100 yards often struck more soil than soldier. Armies relied on mass fire and sharp-blade charges to break an enemy line because only sheer weight of numbers could overcome the gun's limitations. Rifled guns changed everything. By carving spiral grooves into the inside of the barrel, a bullet could spin as it left the opening, stabilizing its flight. The mini-ball fit perfectly into this system. Now a line of infantry could deliver accurate fire hundreds of yards away, thinning enemy ranks long before sharp blades ever clashed. For soldiers, this meant stepping into a battlefield where death reached them from distances their fathers could never have imagined. A farmer-turned-recruit who once hunted deer with a smoothbore at close range suddenly found himself holding a weapon that could kill a man farther than he could clearly see. The range of killing expanded. The safe zones of older wars simply evaporated. This shift had mental consequences. In earlier conflicts, battle was a thunderous up-close affair, smoke thick, enemy faces visible, steel meeting steel. In the Civil War, a man could fall without ever seeing who fired at him. A sharpshooter hidden behind a tree line could strike down an officer across a river. Union General John Sedgwick, remembered for scoffing that they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance, was killed moments later by a Confederate sharpshooter's mini-ball. The combination of rifled guns and mini-balls made the old vision of glory through gallant charges into a nightmare. Lines of blue or gray marched forward, banners waving, only to crumple before unseen rifles. The courage of the soldier mattered less than the cold mathematics of range, reload speed, and cover. But the gun was not the only tool of destruction reshaped by rifling. Cannons, too, underwent their own revolution, extending death even farther across the battlefield. When these new rifled artillery pieces unleashed their thunder, entire formations could vanish in smoke and iron. The Civil War was not merely a clash of men and ideals. It was a laboratory of modern killing. If the rifled gun made the battlefield deadlier at range, artillery made it apocalyptic. By the mid-19th century, cannons were no longer the crude short-range thunderers of earlier wars. Advances in metalworking and rifling meant guns could fire farther, more accurately, and with devastating new types of ammunition. The Civil War became a proving ground for this technology, and the results were catastrophic. Field artillery came in many forms: smoothbore Napoleons, rifled Parrott guns, and the fearsome 3-inch ordnance rifle. Each had its role, but all shared one purpose: to hurl destruction into the enemy's ranks. Canister shot turned a cannon into a giant shotgun, spewing hundreds of iron balls that shredded charging lines at close range. Explosive shells, timed to burst in the air, rained shrapnel down on soldiers huddled behind fences or in shallow ditches. A well-aimed strike could destroy an entire company in seconds. And unlike gunfire, artillery's terror was universal. Soldiers in the thick of battle described the sound of shells screaming overhead, the unnatural shriek of iron spinning through the air. Some men froze at the sound, unable to move. Others forced themselves forward, knowing that any step could be their last. Branches snapped, fences splintered, and bodies were torn apart with horrifying suddenness. One Confederate private remembered that there was no time to pray, only to shiver and wait. Artillery also reshaped landscapes. Hillsides were stripped bare of trees, their trunks shattered by round shot. Farmhouses and barns became rubble within minutes of bombardment. The soil itself seemed to erupt, plumes of earth rising skyward before collapsing into craters. At major battles like Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg, the earth was so churned by shell fire that survivors described the ground as looking plowed by giants. Yet beyond the physical devastation, artillery inflicted deep mental wounds. Infantrymen dreaded charges across open fields, not only because of gunfire, but because they could hear the cannons already being loaded, feel the ground tremble, and see distant flashes announcing death's arrival. The anticipation of bombardment, hours of waiting while shells howled overhead, could break a group's resolve long before an actual clash of sharp blades. Commanders understood the power of artillery and increasingly relied on it to prepare assaults or shatter defenses. But they often underestimated its toll on morale. A line of soldiers might withstand blasts of gunfire, but prolonged shelling wore down discipline, leaving men hollow-eyed and shaking. The thunder of war echoed not only in their ears, but in their memories, haunting them long after the guns fell silent. For both Union and Confederate soldiers, artillery symbolized the industrial scale of the Civil War, a force of destruction impersonal and inescapable. And through their letters and diaries, they left behind chilling testimonies of what it felt like to stand under that storm of iron. Numbers and technology can only tell part of the story. To truly grasp the terror of Civil War artillery, we must turn to the words of those who endured it. Soldiers, officers, even civilians scribbled their memories in letters, diaries, and newspapers, leaving behind a collection of voices that echo across the years. Sergeant Jonathan Stowe of the 15th Massachusetts Infantry recalled one blast with language that borders on poetry. Shells fly past me every few seconds, carrying away branches from trees and scattering limbs around. I am in severe pain, furious how the shells fly. I do sincerely hope I shall not be wounded again. His words capture not only the physical danger, but the unbearable tension, waiting for the next shriek, the next explosion, knowing it could land beside you. Others remembered the eerie contrast between beauty and destruction. A Confederate soldier described cannon fire at dusk as arches of flame cutting the sky, almost heavenly, until the shells burst, tearing men apart. One Union private admitted that the bursts of fire on the horizon looked like a city ablaze. But as the smoke cleared, he realized the glow came from farmhouses shattered and burning. For civilians, the front line sometimes came to their doorsteps. Families living near Gettysburg or Spotsylvania huddled in cellars while windows rattled from the force of artillery. Mothers pressed children to their chests as glass shattered around them. Some emerged after days underground to find their fields cratered, fences torn down, and orchards reduced to splinters. The war did not politely keep its distance. It invaded the very soil of America. Letters home reveal another layer, the struggle to describe the indescribable. Soldiers frequently apologized to parents or sweethearts for what they wrote, fearing that their words could not possibly capture the reality. It is impossible, one young man confessed, to write how it feels to hear the screaming of shells. You must only imagine that hell itself had broken loose. Such testimonies remind us that beyond the strategy and statistics were human beings trying to wrestle horror into sentences. Yet for all the fear, there was also grim resolve. Some soldiers admitted that once the blast began, numbness set in. The mind, overwhelmed, accepted death as inevitable. Others prayed feverishly or sang hymns, voices trembling under the roar. One Confederate captain wrote that during a particularly savage shelling, his men recited the Lord's Prayer aloud together, each line nearly drowned out by the blasts. These personal testimonies strip away the abstractions of history. They remind us that artillery was not simply a weapon of war, but an experience, one that blended sound, light, terror, and resignation into something unforgettable. And while the cannon spoke with industrial fury, the way armies fought on the ground revealed an equally tragic mismatch, old tactics colliding with new realities. The American Civil War was in many ways a clash between centuries. On one side stood weapons born of the industrial age, rifled guns, mini-balls, rifled artillery. On the other stood tactics rooted in an earlier era when armies moved like machines and glory was measured by the steadiness of a line. The result was slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Most of the war's leading generals were graduates of West Point, schooled in old-fashioned doctrine. They had studied the campaigns of Austerlitz and Waterloo, where columns and lines of men advanced shoulder to shoulder, flags flying, drums beating. Such formations had once been effective, their thunderous blasts decisive on smoky fields where smoothbore guns could barely hit a target beyond 50 yards. But by the 1860s, those tactics were relics, and deadly ones at that. Yet tradition carried immense weight. Military honor was tied to discipline in the open, not hiding behind rocks or trees. Commanders feared that looser, scattered formations would dissolve into chaos or cowardice. And so, battle after battle, they ordered men to march in long lines across fields swept by rifled fire. To stand firm in formation was seen as noble. To break for cover was seen as weakness. In the face of modern firepower, such ideals became a death sentence. At places like Fredericksburg, entire Union groups marched again and again into a storm of Confederate fire, only to be cut down before reaching the enemy lines. At Cold Harbor, Union soldiers pinned slips of paper with their names onto their coats so their bodies could be identified, fully aware they were marching into destruction. Still, the orders came, and still the lines advanced. The horror was not lost on the men themselves. Letters speak of soldiers watching comrades fall in neat rows as though harvested by an invisible scythe. Survivors often expressed bitter disbelief. Why had their leaders held on to tactics so plainly unsuited to the weapons at hand? Part of the answer lies in resistance to change. Armies are conservative organizations, slow to change. Another lies in the chaos of a rapidly expanding conflict. Both North and South had swelled their armies with volunteers and newly commissioned officers, many of whom had little or no experience. Without time to train men in new tactics, commanders often defaulted to the familiar drills of old-fashioned warfare. The tragic irony is that even as soldiers adapted instinctively, dropping to the ground, firing from behind fences, digging shallow pits, their superiors often still insisted on the old ways. It would take years of bloodshed and a generation of loss before military doctrine began to shift toward more open formations and dug-in positions. The Civil War thus became not only a struggle over the fate of the Union, but a brutal classroom in which America learned at terrible cost that the future of warfare would no longer be written in neat straight lines. And complicating this tragedy further was the fact that many of the generals giving orders were not seasoned tacticians at all, but political appointees, men elevated more for connections than competence. The Civil War was fought not only with bullets and cannon fire, but also with egos, reputations, and political maneuvering. At the war's outset, the United States had only a small professional army. When conflict erupted, both the Union and the Confederacy had to expand their officer group at breakneck speed. Into that void stepped men of wildly varying talent, some veterans of Mexico, others promoted for loyalty, ambition, or sheer political convenience. The backbone of command came from West Point. Nearly every major battle of the war featured graduates of the academy on both sides, men like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Stonewall Jackson. These officers brought with them the strictness of professional training, the shared textbooks and lectures of their youth, and a common language of strategy. They had drilled together on the Hudson, studied the same campaigns, and carried a sense of brotherhood into a war that now set them against one another. But surrounding these professionals was a swirl of political generals, men appointed because of their connections, influence, or ability to raise troops. For the Union, this was especially common as President Lincoln faced the delicate task of holding together a divided coalition of northern states. To secure support from immigrant communities, he commissioned men like Franz Sigel, a German revolutionary whose command skills often failed to match his reputation among German-American voters. Others, such as Nathaniel Banks and Benjamin Butler, owed their stars more to political service than to battlefield competence. The Confederacy was not immune to this phenomenon. Though smaller and more militarized in culture, it too elevated men of local influence who lacked significant military experience. In both armies, the clash between professional officers and political appointees created tension, miscommunication, and at times disaster. A group might fight bravely only to be squandered by the blunders of its commander. For the soldiers who bore the brunt of these decisions, the results could be devastating. Letters home often mention frustration with leaders who seemed blind to the realities of the battlefield. Union privates cursed generals who ordered suicidal assaults. Confederate soldiers lamented missed opportunities because of hesitation or mismanagement at the top. The rank and file understood all too well that their lives were often balanced on the judgment or foolishness of the men in charge. And yet leadership was not simply about skill. It was also about charisma, about the ability to hold an army together when hunger gnawed and fear threatened to break their lines. Here, men like Lee and Grant proved invaluable. Lee's calm authority and devotion to Virginia inspired loyalty even in defeat. Grant's quiet determination, what Lincoln called his refusal to whine or excuse, gave the Union Army a steady hand when others faltered. The Civil War thus revealed two competing realities of command: the professionalism of men forged at West Point, and the instability of leaders chosen for politics. The mixture was explosive, and on the battlefield, it often meant the difference between victory and catastrophe. Still, even the most gifted general could not always protect his men from the storm of modern firepower. And when land offered cover, desperate soldiers clung to it, defying the old doctrines in a bid to survive. Despite the stubborn adherence to old-fashioned doctrine, the chaos of the battlefield often forced soldiers and officers alike to improvise. The notion of gallantly standing shoulder to shoulder in open fields quickly gave way to a simpler truth: cover meant survival. When rocks, trees, or walls were available, men instinctively dropped behind them, creating makeshift defenses even as their generals urged them forward. At Antietam in 1862, this instinct took on legendary form. The Union Army under General Burnside attempted to cross a narrow stone bridge over Antietam Creek. On the opposite bank, a mere 500 Confederate defenders hunkered behind trees, fences, and rocks. Hidden from view, they unleashed withering fire on group after group of Union soldiers. The attackers, trapped on the exposed bridge and riverbanks, fell in heaps. It took hours and thousands of casualties before Burnside's men finally forced a crossing. To this day, that small span of stone is remembered as Burnside's Bridge, a symbol of how cover and land could give a handful of defenders the power to halt an army. Examples like this were scattered across the war. At Fredericksburg, Confederate troops dug into a sunken road behind a stone wall. As Union lines advanced across open ground, the defenders fired with near impunity, mowing them down in waves. It was not war, one Union survivor wrote. It was murder. The landscape itself had become a weapon, increasing the deadliness of rifled guns. These scenes hinted at the trench warfare that would dominate Europe half a century later. Even when commanders resisted, soldiers themselves carved shallow rifle pits or piled up fence rails for protection. The ground became scarred with makeshift defenses, the first hints of a new style of war where the earth itself was enlisted as an ally. Civilians noticed the transformation, too. Farmers returned to find their fields pocked with ditches and mounds, their fences taken apart to build barriers. Orchards were stripped bare not just by artillery but by desperate men seeking firewood or cover. The American landscape, once a backdrop for rolling farms and quiet towns, was reshaped into a theater of death and survival. The lesson was clear to those who lived it: the days of rigid lines and open fields were numbered. But tragically, this realization came only after countless lives had already been lost. And nowhere was the futility of old tactics in the face of modern firepower more painfully displayed than in the rolling fields of Gettysburg, where Robert E. Lee ordered one of the most infamous charges in American history. By the summer of 1863, the war had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. But it was at Gettysburg that the brutality of modern weapons against outdated tactics reached its grim peak. For 3 days, Union and Confederate forces clashed across the fields and ridges of southern Pennsylvania in what would become the largest battle ever fought on American soil. More than 160,000 men stood in arms. By the time the smoke cleared, over 50,000 were dead, wounded, or missing. On the third day of battle, General Robert E. Lee made a fateful decision. Convinced that Union lines had been weakened after 2 days of fighting, he ordered an assault meant to shatter the center of the enemy position on Cemetery Ridge. The plan called for nearly 12,500 Confederate infantry to advance across open farmland, 3/4 of a mile of flat, exposed ground, straight into the heart of Union defenses. It would become known as Pickett's Charge. The attack began with a thunderous Confederate artillery blast, the largest of the war. For 2 hours, cannons thundered, their smoke blanketing the fields and rattling the windows of houses miles away. Civilians later said the ground trembled as though shaken by an earthquake. Lee hoped the blast would break Union defenses, or at least weaken them enough for the infantry to punch through. When the cannons fell silent, the gray lines formed. Men under George Pickett, along with divisions led by Pettigrew and Trimble, aligned in near-perfect rows. Flags lifted, drums beat, and the order came. They stepped forward into history. The march across that field was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial at first. Union soldiers watched from the ridge as the gray waves rolled toward them, sunlight glinting off sharp blades. It was a sight of terrible grandeur, thousands moving as one, banners swaying, officers riding on horseback. But grandeur quickly gave way to horror. The Union artillery opened fire. Shells burst among the advancing Confederates, tearing gaps in the lines. Men fell screaming. Flags dropped. Yet the survivors closed ranks and pressed forward. Then came the gunfire. From behind stone walls and fences, Union infantry unleashed a storm of mini-balls. Each blast cut swaths through the Confederate ranks. Still they advanced, a mile-long column trudging through smoke and fire. Some Confederates did reach the Union lines. In desperate hand-to-hand combat, they thrust sharp blades and swung rifle butts, breaching the stone wall in places. But the numbers were against them. Reinforcements poured into the Union center, and the Confederate attack crumbled under the weight of relentless fire. By the time the survivors staggered back across that bloody field, more than 6,000 Confederate soldiers had fallen in less than an hour. Entire groups were reduced to fragments. Lee, watching from a distance, is said to have murmured, "It is all my fault." For many historians, Pickett's charge marked the high-water mark of the Confederacy, the moment when its grand hopes crested before breaking on the rock of Union resolve. The scene at Gettysburg revealed the full futility of marrying old-fashioned tactics to 19th-century firepower. And it was not only the scale of casualties that seared itself into memory, but also the deafening roar that preceded them, a bombardment so immense it was said to be the loudest sound ever heard in North America up to that point. The assault across Gettysburg's fields was more than just a military move. It was a human drama played out step by agonizing step. Survivors recalled the oppressive July heat, the sharp smoke hanging over the fields, and the eerie silence just before the order to advance. Then came the long march forward, where each man knew that survival was as uncertain as the toss of a coin. The Confederates advanced in perfect lines, officers urging their men to keep step despite the growing storm. To onlookers, it seemed impossible that such discipline could hold under fire. Union artillery found its range quickly. Shells burst in the midst of the gray ranks, sending men and banners tumbling into the grass. Still, the survivors closed ranks, stepping over the fallen, determined to carry their flags forward. As the Confederates drew closer, the true horror unfolded. Union rifles loaded with mini-balls tore through their formations with precision. The sound was described as a continuous ripping of cloth, blast after blast tearing holes in the advancing tide. Survivors remembered the air filled not just with smoke, but with the screams of the wounded, calling out for water, for help, for their mothers. Yet still they came. One Union soldier later wrote that the sight inspired both awe and pity. It was magnificent. It was war in its grandest form, and it was murder. The Confederate soldiers pressed through fences, over rail lines, and across open fields littered with the fallen. By the time they reached the Union stone wall, their numbers had been cut nearly in half. The clash at the wall was savage, sharp blades thrust, rifle butt swung, and men grappled in desperate hand-to-hand combat. For a fleeting moment, Confederate flags waved atop the wall, and it seemed as though the charge might succeed. But Union reinforcements surged forward, pouring fire into the breach. The Confederate wave, so orderly at the start, dissolved into fragments of companies, then into scattered survivors. General George Pickett, whose division gave the charge its name, was not at the front, but waiting to rally his men. When the survivors stumbled back, bloodied and broken, one officer told him his division had been destroyed. Pickett, stunned, could only repeat, "General, I have no division." The cost was staggering, over 6,000 casualties in less than an hour. Whole units ceased to exist. Friends marched side by side only to see one another fall within feet. For the Confederacy, the charge represented both incredible bravery and irreversible loss. For the Union, it was proof that their lines could hold, that their artillery and rifles could repel even the most determined assault. Pickett's charge entered legend as both a symbol of Southern gallantry and of the tragic futility of outdated tactics. It was the Civil War distilled into a single event, courage colliding with technology, tradition shattered by industrial firepower. And if the rifles cut down men with deadly precision, it was the artillery blast that set the stage, shaking the earth with a fury unmatched in North America until the 20th century. Before Pickett's men ever set foot on the field, the earth shook under one of the most ferocious bombardments of the 19th century. At Gettysburg on July 3, 1863, Confederate artillery unleashed a blast designed to crush Union lines and soften them for the charge to come. Over 150 Confederate guns fired in unison, their thunder rolling across the Pennsylvania countryside in waves. Witnesses compared the sound to a continuous roar of thunder, louder and more sustained than any storm. Union artillery responded with equal fury, and soon the sky was alive with shrieking shells and billowing smoke. The air grew thick with the sharp stench of gunpowder, while flashes of orange fire punctured the haze. For 2 hours, the bombardment raged, deafening soldiers who crouched behind stone walls and splintering trees into jagged shards. To many, it felt as though the heavens themselves had opened in wrath. Historians have since called this blast the loudest man-made sound on the North American continent until the detonation of the first atomic bomb in 1945. Imagine the mental impact, thousands of men pinned to the earth, unable to act, their ears ringing, their nerves frayed by the ceaseless pounding of exploding shells. Horses panicked and bolted, wagons overturned, and entire batteries were silenced as their gunners were torn apart. And yet, for all its fury, the Confederate bombardment failed in its purpose. Much of the fire overshot the Union positions, striking empty fields or rear areas. The Union artillery, by contrast, saved its strength and responded with deadly accuracy once the charge began. Confederate soldiers who had huddled with confidence during the blast rose to advance only to discover that the Union lines were far from broken. For those who endured it, the artillery was not just destructive, it was disorienting. Colonel Joseph Mayo of the 3rd Virginia Infantry described the moment when the shells found their range. The first shot or two flew harmlessly overhead, but soon they began to get the range, and then came pandemonium. There was an explosion on the top of a tree, then another, followed by piercing shrieks. 2 men were killed outright, 3 frightfully wounded. Our company suffered terribly. His words convey the surreal mix of awe and horror, of watching nature itself explode into fragments of iron and wood. The bombardment at Gettysburg was a grim preview of the wars to come. The mechanized thunder that shook those fields would echo half a century later in the trenches of the Western Front, when artillery fire would become the dominant killer of World War I. But for the men in 1863, there was no precedent. They were the first Americans to experience the battlefield transformed into a vast roaring machine. And yet, even amid that chaos, voices survived, diaries, letters, and recollections that captured the human experience of enduring such storms. Their words remind us that beyond statistics and strategy, the Civil War was lived moment by moment under fire, with death all around. If the artillery blast was the overture to Pickett's charge, the testimonies of the men who endured it provide the human notes of fear, resilience, and disbelief. Their words carry us into the smoke and thunder more vividly than any statistic ever could. Colonel Joseph Mayo, writing from the shattered ranks of the 3rd Virginia Infantry, remembered the eerie rhythm of shells overhead, the first harmless bursts, the growing accuracy, and then pandemonium. His account tells of branches torn from trees, piercing shrieks, and comrades cut down in an instant. In his company alone, 2 killed outright, 3 mangled. For him, the battlefield was no orderly clash of arms, but a storm of iron and fire that reduced disciplined ranks to fragments of men clinging to survival. Other voices echoed his despair. A Union gunner described watching Confederate lines stagger under his battery's fire. We could see them reel and waver, then close up, then reel again. Still, they came. His words convey both the deadly efficiency of Union defenses and a kind of horrified respect for the determination of the enemy. Private diaries reveal the mental torment behind the statistics. One Confederate soldier admitted he could not lift his rifle during the charge, his arms trembling too violently. Another Union private, crouched behind the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, wrote that he fired mechanically, without aiming, without thinking, only firing. And still they came. Both accounts lay bare the human cost of what military textbooks might call contact with the enemy. For some, faith became a refuge. Soldiers on both sides invoked God's will in their letters home, framing survival or death as providence rather than chance. Hymns were sung as men marched into fire, psalms whispered as shells shrieked overhead. Religion offered a language for the indescribable, a way to make sense of the randomness of survival. Yet, even amid such devastation, men noticed details that revealed their humanity. One Union soldier recalled seeing a Confederate flag rise briefly above the stone wall before toppling into the smoke, a fleeting symbol of courage extinguished. Another Confederate remembered glancing sideways mid-charge and realizing his boyhood friend marching just a yard away was suddenly gone, vanished into the chaos. These voices remind us that Gettysburg was not just strategy and numbers, but lived experience, men choking on powder smoke, deafened by explosions, hearts pounding as they fought for their lives. Their words bridge the gap between past and present, allowing us to hear the battlefield through their ears, to see it through their eyes. But out of these memories also came a lesson, slowly learned, bitterly paid for: the traditional tactics could no longer stand against industrial weapons. And as the war dragged on, both Union and Confederate commanders would finally adapt, embracing earthworks and trenches in a desperate attempt to shield their men from destruction. By 1864, the truth was undeniable: open field charges, once celebrated as the pinnacle of battlefield courage, had become nothing more than mass executions. The appalling losses at Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and Cold Harbor forced even the most stubborn commanders to reconsider how they fought. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the Civil War began to shift away from old-fashioned pageantry and toward something darker, more modern: trench warfare. Nowhere was this transition more evident than at the Siege of Petersburg. What began as an attempt by Union forces under General Grant to capture the city quickly turned into a stalemate. Both sides dug into the earth, constructing networks of trenches, rifle pits, and earthworks that stretched for miles. Soldiers huddled in muddy ditches, their lives measured not in heroic charges, but in the endurance to withstand shell fire, hunger, and disease. For the men in those trenches, the war became a test of wearing down. Nights were filled with the crack of sharpshooters and the hiss of shells. Days dragged on with little movement, only the endless labor of shoring up defenses. Letters from the front described the monotony punctuated by terror: the sudden scream of artillery, the collapse of a trench wall burying comrades alive, the ceaseless rain turning the ground into a mire of filth. At Petersburg, new technologies made their debut. Union forces experimented with tunneling beneath Confederate lines, culminating in the infamous Battle of the Crater, where explosives created a yawning pit that swallowed soldiers by the hundreds. But poor coordination turned opportunity into disaster as Union troops stumbled into the very hole their engineers had created, where Confederate counterattacks trapped and slaughtered them. It was a grim preview of the catastrophic learning curve that industrial warfare demanded. Both North and South also began to recognize the value of prepared defenses. Logs, sandbags, and dirt mounds became as important as rifles and sharp blades. What generals once dismissed as cowardice was now necessity. The lesson was written in blood: men in cover survived, men in the open died. The earthworks of Petersburg foreshadowed the trenches of the Western Front in World War I. The resemblance is striking: long fortified lines, static positions, battles decided by artillery blasts rather than movement. The Civil War, intended by many to be a quick and glorious affair, had become a brutal laboratory for the warfare of the future. But even amid this grim transformation, innovation continued. The war had not yet exhausted its horrors, for a new weapon was about to make its appearance on the battlefield: the Gatling gun, a mechanical harbinger of the machine age. In the muddy fields of Petersburg, alongside the trenches and earthworks, another innovation made its first tentative appearance: the Gatling gun. Invented in 1861 by Richard Jordan Gatling, this crank-operated weapon could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, an astonishing leap forward in firepower compared to the single-shot guns carried by most soldiers. Gatling himself hoped his creation might actually reduce the slaughter of war, arguing that one man with a Gatling gun could replace dozens with rifles, thereby sparing lives. The battlefield, however, told a different story. Though used only sparingly during the Civil War, the Gatling gun represented the dawning of a new age. At Petersburg, Union forces tested the weapon in limited fights, mowing down Confederate charges with terrifying efficiency. Accounts describe its barrels spinning furiously, the chatter of bullets unending, and lines of attackers crumpling under a storm of lead. Soldiers who witnessed its use spoke with awe and unease, sensing that something fundamentally new had entered the art of killing. The Gatling gun's true impact would come later in colonial wars and eventually in the trenches of World War I, but its shadow loomed over Petersburg like a prophecy. Here was a machine that embodied the very essence of industrial warfare: mechanized, relentless, impersonal. No longer was killing the slow work of steady hands and aimed shots. Now it could be done by turning a crank. And yet commanders in the Civil War were slow to embrace it. Many distrusted the new weapon, preferring tried-and-true artillery or mass gun fire. Others considered it too heavy, unreliable, or wasteful of precious ammunition. In a war already plagued by supply shortages, few were eager to add another hungry mouth of iron to feed. Still, its appearance marked a turning point. With the Gatling gun, the old dream of glorious charges became even more outdated. Against its hail of fire, the courage of advancing infantry mattered little. Strategy and bravery could be destroyed in seconds by mechanical efficiency. The war had revealed a terrible truth: technology was beginning to outweigh valor as the decisive factor in battle. Looking back, the Civil War appears not only as a national struggle over union and freedom, but also as a crossroads in the history of warfare itself. Guns gave way to rifles, cannons to rifled artillery, and now at Petersburg, hand-loaded blasts to the grinding rhythm of the machine gun's ancestor. The lessons were written plainly in the blood-soaked fields of Virginia, but they would not be fully heeded until half a century later when Europe plunged into the Great War. For the men who fought in the 1860s, however, the Gatling gun was simply another reminder of the war's cruelty, a glimpse of a future they could not yet name, but which they had already begun to endure. And as the conflict dragged to its weary end, what lingered most was not the novelty of new weapons, but the staggering human cost. When the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the United States emerged not triumphant, but hollowed out. The numbers themselves are staggering: over 620,000 dead, a figure that may climb even higher by some modern estimates. This meant nearly 1 in 4 soldiers who marched away to war never returned. In a nation of just over 31 million people, the loss represented roughly 8% of the entire male population, a wound that touched every farm, every town, every church pew. The cost was not evenly shared. In some communities, whole companies of men had enlisted together, neighbors and cousins filling the ranks side by side. When those groups were cut down, the hometown they left behind became a place of silence. A single afternoon's fighting could erase a generation of brothers and friends from a single county. Letters from mothers and widows filled with grief reveal the war's true battlefield, the empty kitchen tables and untended fields of the home front. The sight of maimed veterans was a constant reminder of the price paid. Amputees crowded railway platforms, their crutches thumping against wooden boards, their uniforms ragged. They returned to farms where plows now seemed impossibly heavy, to shops where work they once performed with ease was now out of reach. Yet many endured with remarkable resilience, shaping the first American veterans' culture, forming groups that would demand recognition and support long after the war. Cemeteries, too, became new landscapes of mourning. Fields that once bore crops now sprouted headstones. Families traveled miles to find the graves of their sons, only to discover them in rows of the unnamed, marked simply as unknown U.S. soldier. The scale of burial was unprecedented. Entire sections of land were made into national cemeteries. Gettysburg itself became not only a battlefield but a shrine to the fallen. The demographic impact was profound. With so many young men lost, marriage rates shifted, widows outnumbered eligible bachelors, and communities adjusted to a future forever changed. Some southern counties would not recover their pre-war male population for decades. In the north, factories found themselves staffed increasingly by women, immigrants, and the very veterans who could no longer work the land. Even the nation's spirit bore scars. Writers of the post-war generation often described a sense of melancholy hanging over American life. The war had resolved great political questions, union preserved, slavery abolished, but it had left behind a society haunted by absence. For those who survived, the memory of the war was not one of clean victories, but of endless funerals. The Civil War was not only the deadliest conflict in American history. It was also the most intimate. No family was untouched. No community was spared. And as the United States looked toward rebuilding, it carried with it the sobering knowledge that the price of unity had been a generation itself. In the years that followed Appomattox, the Civil War refused to fade. Its shadows stretched far beyond the graves and amputee wards. It reshaped how Americans thought about war, death, and memory itself. For the first time in U.S. history, the nation had to grapple with loss on an industrial scale, and it turned to ritual, symbolism, and collective remembrance to endure. Cemeteries became sacred ground. Arlington, once the estate of Robert E. Lee, was transformed into a national cemetery, a deliberate act of both practicality and symbolism. Across the North and South, smaller cemeteries filled with rows of identical headstones, creating landscapes of mourning that forced Americans to confront the cost of the Union's survival. To walk among them was to see absence given physical form. From this grief emerged new traditions. Soldiers' graves were decorated with flowers each spring, ceremonies that evolved into Memorial Day. What began as local acts of remembrance, widows placing wreaths, children scattering petals, grew into a national ritual. In these gestures lay both mourning and meaning, a way to honor sacrifice, but also to give structure to grief too vast for words. The veterans themselves carried the war in their bodies and minds. Organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic in the North and the United Confederate Veterans in the South gave them fellowship, political influence, and a voice in shaping how the war would be remembered. They marched in parades, raised monuments, and passed down stories that hardened into legend. Their presence kept the memory of battle alive for generations who had never seen the smoke of a battlefield. But memory was never neutral. In the South, the lost cause narrative emerged, recasting defeat as noble tragedy and obscuring slavery as the war's central cause. In the North, veterans framed the Union victory as proof of the Republic's endurance and divine favor. Between these competing memories, the true human cost often receded, overshadowed by myth-making. Yet for families with empty chairs at the table, the cost never needed embellishment. It was carved into their daily lives. The Civil War also altered the very notion of citizenship. Freedmen's cemeteries bore witness to the price African American soldiers paid in the struggle for emancipation. Their graves, silent proof that freedom was not given, but earned in blood. The service of black soldiers forced a reckoning with what it meant to be an American, though the promises of equality would remain contested for decades to come. Above all, the war taught that technology and modern industry had forever changed the nature of battle. Rifled guns, artillery blasts, earthworks, and even the early rumble of mechanized firepower had revealed that the age of heroic charges was over. Generals in Europe studied these lessons closely. When the Great War erupted in 1914, echoes of Antietam and Petersburg could be heard in the trenches of the Somme and Verdun. The Civil War's shadow was long indeed. It lay across America's cemeteries and battlefields, across its politics and memory, across its sense of itself. The war had ended, but its consequences lingered, reminding every generation that the cost of disunion, and of clinging to the past in an age of change, was measured not only in ideals, but in lives. The American Civil War stands as both a tragedy and a turning point, a war that consumed a generation while reshaping the future of the nation. Its cost was staggering: hundreds of thousands dead, communities hollowed out, a society draped in mourning. Yet, its legacy reached far beyond the graves. It forced Americans to confront the reality of industrialized killing, to acknowledge that courage and sacrifice could not overcome the deadly precision of modern weapons. The conflict preserved the Union and ended slavery. But it also left behind scars, physical, emotional, and cultural, that would endure for decades. Veterans limped through town squares as living reminders of sacrifice. Widows and orphans carried grief into the next century. Cemeteries became national monuments to both unity and loss. And each spring, flowers placed on soldiers' graves reminded Americans of the fragile line between memory and forgetting. Militarily, the Civil War foreshadowed the wars to come. Trenches, rifled artillery, and the tentative horror of the Gatling gun pointed toward a new era where technology would dominate the battlefield. The lessons written in blood at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg would be studied by European officers who later dug their own networks of trenches in World War I. What seemed uniquely American in the 1860s would prove to be a grim preview of global conflict. Culturally, the war's memory split the nation even as it sought to heal. In the North, victory was framed as proof of democratic endurance. In the South, the lost cause narrative reshaped defeat into a story of honor, defiance, and tragedy. Between them lay the unspoken truth: the war had been about slavery, freedom, and the future of the Republic. And though emancipation was won on paper, the struggle for equality was only beginning. Yet through all its pain, the Civil War remains a defining moment in American identity. It revealed the nation's capacity for both destruction and renewal, for division and reconciliation. It was a crucible in which the United States was tested not only as a military power but as an idea. The price was almost unbearable, but out of the ashes emerged a country that could no longer pretend its future was anything but bound together. Today, when we stand at Gettysburg or Antietam, or walk among the rows of white headstones at Arlington, we hear echoes of that cost. The silence of those fields is louder than any cannon, reminding us that the Civil War was not just history. It was lived experience, paid for in blood. It remains the deadliest conflict in American history, a warning and a legacy all at once. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: the Civil War revealed not only how fragile the American experiment was, but also how determined it was to endure.